You are listening to Chapter 3 of the Atheist Bible. This chapter presents a theory of truth that is inspired by machine learning, a domain of artificial intelligence. This chapter is rather theoretical, and therefore, we skip forward directly to the summary of the first part of this chapter. The first part of the chapter basically argues that we perceive ourselves in a continuous stream of perceptions. We smell something, we see something, we feel something, we hear something. Our goal is to use past perceptions to predict future perceptions. For this purpose, we build theories of the form, if I observe X, then I will observe Y, or if I do X, then I will observe Y. For example, a simple theory is, if I do not eat breakfast, then I will be hungry around noon. Theories can also be scientific theories, such as, if I throw a stone at this angle, then it will fall down at this position. If a theory has made a large number of correct predictions, we come to trust the theory. We say it is validated. In the ideal case, we test the theory by repeatedly triggering the premise and observing whether the conclusion of the theory holds. For example, by throwing the stone repeatedly at the same angle and observing where it falls down. However, neither testing nor validation guarantees that the theory will always make correct predictions. In our example, we may be mistaken about the position of the stone when we try with a larger stone. Therefore, we constantly refine our theories until they correspond as well as possible to our observations. Those theories that always correspond to our observations are what we call the truth. The problem is, of course, that we never know whether a theory will always correspond to our observations. This is why we humans take a rather humble position in this universe. We try to describe our reality by theories. We validate the theories, we refine the theories, and we hope that they are the truth. But in the end, we have no guarantee that nature behaves as we predict. When a true theory makes a prediction, we call that theory and its premises evidence for the prediction. For example, the evidence for the hypothesis that the stone probably landed in that position, even if you can't see it, is the theory of ballistics plus the fact that you threw it at this angle. In everyday life, evidence for a hypothesis is often hard to come by. The definite truth of theories is hard to establish. Concepts are not defined clearly, different theories can make different predictions, and new evidence can appear at any moment. This is why we find ourselves in a continuous process of what is called joint inference. We evaluate reasons for and against a statement and try to estimate its likelihood. Even with joint inference, though, we cannot predict everything. Some things are just unknown, and that is okay. As Salvador Dali said, don't be afraid of perfection. You will never achieve it. There is one particular class of theories that merits our attention. As an example, consider the following theory. If you pull the lever of the slot machine in the right way, then you win. This theory sounds enticing because it seemingly tells you how to win with the slot machine. Yet as soon as you try out the theory, you find that it does not work. You don't know how to pull the lever in the right way. You know whether you found the right way only afterwards, when you see the outcome. Then, however, you do not actually need the theory. A theory is useful and meaningful only when it tells you about the outcome beforehand. At the same time, the theory cannot be proven wrong. If you don't win, then you simply did not pull the lever in the right way. And if you do win, and you try the same way of pulling the lever again, and it does not work, then this means that you still don't know how to pull the lever in the right way, and you simply won by chance in your first round. Thus, no matter what happens, you cannot conclude that the theory is wrong. This means that the theory is what we call unfalsifiable. Any theory that is unfalsifiable is automatically meaningless. If there is any event that the theory predicts, then the non-occurrence of that event would prove the theory wrong. Now, if the theory cannot be proven wrong, then this can mean only that the theory predicts no event. And if the theory predicts no event, then it is thus literally meaningless. Unfalsifiability and meaninglessness are but two sides of the same coin. Our next topic is the theory of truth. Technically speaking, the theory of truth that we have just presented is a definition of the word true. It holds that if the conclusions of some theory consistently correspond to our experiences, we call that theory true. And indeed, this is by and large what the average person regards as truth. For the purposes of this book, we have defined theories as sets of logical rules. Such theories of logical rules are useful when we want to explain our reasoning, justify a choice, or convince another. However, in general, these rules are just a model for the fact that people use past experience to predict future perceptions. They do so not by computing conclusions of rules, but by running parallel neural processes in their heads. Indeed, American philosopher Rick Grush has argued that the brain is constantly generating and updating a mental model of its environment with the goal of making predictions from sensory input in a theory known as predictive coding. This theory has been further developed into the predictive processing model, a theory in cognitive and computational neuroscience that sees the brain as a complex, multi-layered prediction engine. As George Bach said, all models are wrong, but some are useful. Our next topic is learning theories. In everyday life, our theories are rarely verbal and explicit. Rather, they are a body of knowledge about the patterns that we observe in this world. For example, we pretty quickly build the theory that if we touch a hot oven, we will then feel pain. This theory helps explain past instances of pain and is very effective in preventing future instances of pain. We build theories about everything around us, possibly starting as a baby. On this view, the baby's job is to discover the patterns that govern how the physical world works, and encapsulate them in theories that can be used to predict what will happen in new situations. By the time we are adult, we have built up a corpus of theories. These theories can pretty accurately give a structure to our past and predict much of the immediate future. As Voltaire said, all people are smart, some before and others afterwards. Our next topic is correction. If a theory has consistently yielded correct explanations in the past, we trust its predictions also for the future. Now, what happens if a theory has made thousands of correct conclusions in the past, but then one day delivers a false prediction? For example, consider the theory that speed adds up. If I walk at 6 kilometers per hour in a train that runs at 100 kilometers per hour, then my speed relative to the ground is 106 kilometers per hour. This theory makes lots of true predictions. Now assume that there is a screen at the end of the rails, some kilometers down in the direction of travel. Assume that I point at that screen with a laser pointer from the train. You stand at the station and also point at the screen with a laser pointer. Then my laser beam should travel faster than yours. If we both switch on the laser pointer at the same time, in the very moment the train passes the station, then my dot should show up on the screen slightly earlier than yours. Yet it does not. Both dots appear at the same time. The speed of both laser beams is the same, no matter whether it is measured relative to the ground or relative to the train. This is confusing and contradicts the theory that speeds add up. In such a case, the prediction of the theory is false. This is surprising because the theory has made zillions of correct predictions in the past. Still, its prediction in the case of the laser beam is false. In fact, most of its predictions are false when the speed approaches the speed of light. Therefore, no matter how plausible this theory sounds, and no matter how many correct predictions it has made in the past, it is false in the general case. Importantly, it is not reality that needs fixing. It is the theory that needs fixing. This is indeed what happened to the theory. German-born physicist Albert Einstein had the courage to say that if the theory does not correspond to the facts, then it had to be changed. He thought up a new theory that permits light to always have the same speed. This theory entails all kinds of weird things, such as objects gaining infinite weight when they approach the speed of light. Despite its counterintuitive conclusions, this theory turned out to make consistently correct predictions in realms where the earlier model did not. It is known as the special theory of relativity. The ability to see that a theory is wrong and the readiness to abandon it if it does not correspond to the facts is one of the cornerstones of rational thinking. In many cases, a theory is not actually wrong in itself. It just needs additional premises. The theory that speed values add up, for example, is not outright wrong. It provides very good approximations of reality under the condition that the speeds we are talking about are small, to a degree that the average human is unlikely to bother with special relativity in real life. The problem is just that it is very hard to identify the conditions, that is, the additional premises, under which a theory is true. This issue is known as the Duhem-Quine problem. In philosophy, the fact that a validated theory may turn out to be false is known as the problem of induction. Scottish philosopher David Hume illustrated it with the story of a rooster. which was fed every day by friendly humans. Every day, the rooster received confirming evidence for his theory that humans are friendly animals who want my best. This theory was correct until Christmas when the humans had him for dinner. As Soren Kierkegaard said, life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. Our next topic is science. Science can be understood as a more systematic variant of our everyday search for true theories. Science continuously builds theories and tests them to see if their predictions are consistently correct. When scientists propose a new theory, they conduct experiments to show that the theory makes predictions that correspond to reality. Other scientists try to build experiments that show that the theory makes false predictions. If a theory turns out to make consistently correct predictions, it is accepted into the corpus of scientific theories. This does not mean, however, that the theory would be the truth. A theory can always make a false prediction one day. This is why scientific theories are called theories. Even universally accepted laws, such as the law that all objects with mass or energy gravitate towards each other, are still called theories. If one day any theory is found to make a false prediction, then the theory will no longer be considered an approximation of truth. This entails that science never proves that a theory is true. Science just builds models of reality. As Edward Feigenbaum said, science is the profession of induction. And our next topic is the theory of truth in practice. Our theory of truth is hard to apply literally in practice. People do not carry a set of logical rules with them, and even if they did, many rules would be ill-defined, contradictory, not validated, or outright false. This does not mean, however, that our theory of truth would be useless. Quite the contrary, the theory allows for some important steps in our quest for finding the truth. First, it instructs us to exclude unfalsifiable statements from our discourse. These can never predict anything, and they are thus meaningless in the sense of this book. If we accepted such statements, we would open the door to accepting all other kinds of bogus theories like conspiracy theories and pseudoscience. Both in their ilk all have in common that we would never be able to find out whether they are false. Falsifiability is the bulwark against such nonsense. The second thing that our theory of truth allows us to do is to exclude theories that have consistently clashed with our perceptions. These are false theories. In our search for truth, false theories are as important as correct theories. Knowing them allows us to reject invalid claims and to avoid drawing false conclusions. Finally, and most importantly, the theory tells us at least what we would have to do if we wanted to check the truth of a hypothesis. We have to find evidence, and that is, we have to find a true theory that predicts the statement. This is a fundamental insight. It allows us to weigh our confidence in a statement by the evidence that we have for it. We should not believe strongly in a statement for which we have only weak evidence. In particular, we should not make life-changing decisions based on weak or no evidence. As Thomas Paine said, ignorance is of a peculiar nature. Once dispelled, it is impossible to reestablish it. Though man may be kept ignorant, he cannot be made ignorant. Our next topic is common mistakes. We will now look into common mistakes that people make in their search for truth. We will illustrate each mistake by an example. We will then apply our theory of truth to find out what the problem is in the example scenario. And as we shall see, the theory of truth allows us to identify and rebuke the mistakes reliably. The examples that we will use are quite abstract, even absurd, you may say. And yet, as we will argue, they appear in very similar form in the world's major religions. A first common mistake that people make is that they assume that something is true because it makes sense. Let us look at an example. In historical times, people thought that certain illnesses were caused by bad blood. Hence, they reasoned, the illness could be cured by removing the bad blood. Therefore, they punctured the arm of the ill person and let the blood come out. This practice, bloodletting as it was known, was widespread from the ancient Greeks to the 18th century. It made a lot of sense to people. However, it did not have any positive effect. On the contrary, in the overwhelming majority of cases, the historical use of bloodletting was harmful to patients. This shows us that a theory can be false even if it makes sense to us. A theory does not become true if it makes sense. It becomes true if it makes correct predictions. To check if a theory makes correct predictions, we have to systematically validate it. In our example, we would have to recruit a number of patients with the same symptoms and submit a randomly chosen half of them, with consent, to bloodletting. If the group that underwent the procedure fares better than the other group, the practice can be assumed to be helpful. But if it does not, the method has to be abandoned. We will argue later that the failure to see this, and the reliance on the intuitive sense instead of on concrete and correct predictions, is one of the pillars of religious belief. As Grace Hopper said, one accurate measurement is worth 1,000 expert opinions. Another type of mistake people make is what we will call ghostification. For example, many ancient peoples believed that inanimate objects were inhabited by spirits. Let us assume that one particular people believed that fire was kept alive by fire demons. Based on this, they could have built the following theory. If you pour water over a fire, the fire demon is chased away. If the fire demon is chased away, the fire dies. This theory is true. It makes correct predictions about how we can extinguish a fire. There is indeed nothing wrong with this theory. The fire demons are just an auxiliary notion. Much like molecules and energy or grammatical gender are auxiliary notions of the respective sciences. These auxiliary notions can be called by any name we want. For example, we could have said that water tickles the fire fairy, and when the fire fairy is tickled, the fire dies. Today, we would rather say that the water cools down the fuel, and that this loss of heat extinguishes the fire. It really does not matter what we call that auxiliary state, as long as its meaning is that the fire dies. The theory becomes problematic only when we start making additional assumptions about those fire demons. Fire demons are evil creatures. If you are not kind to them, they may refuse to be chased away. There is no evidence for the statement that fire demons are evil. The claim that we have to be kind to them in order to be able to extinguish the fire is even outright false. Thus, by adding such suppositions, we leave the ground of validated theories and venture into the domain of falsehood and nonsense. We ghostify the theory. And indeed, throughout history, people have tried to explain the phenomena of nature by personifying them. While these personifications may have made correct predictions, they often also developed a life of their own and became ghostification. And further down the road, religions. We will later argue that modern religions, too, piggyback on otherwise reasonable theories in a similar fashion. For example, prayer works because it helps us reflect our lives, not because there would be a God who listens. A religious community is fulfilling because of common chants and activities, and not because of some magical connection with the supernatural. In this way, religion infuses its own supernatural entities into otherwise reasonable theories. Thus, religion lives from the ghostified versions of these theories. To illustrate our next point, imagine a people with an elaborate system of myths and collective wisdom. One of their omens is as follows, and that day will be a great day. After that day, no one will be as they were before, and that day will show the grandness and glory of the God of the sun. This theory seems to be making predictions. Yet it is completely unclear when the theory refers to. Was today a great day? Should we expect the God of the sun? And if so, what does it mean that the day will show the grandness of that God? Will he actually appear? Or is the grandness rather shown implicitly? The theory is just not clear. The criterion that helps us here is falsifiability. The theory is not falsifiable. There is nothing that we would accept as a proof that the theory is false. Even if no great day has arrived so far, adherents of the omen can still claim it will arrive one day. With this, the theory cannot make any concrete predictions about the real world. It is nonsensical. Such theories can be poetic and beautiful, but they cannot be true. And yet, many people like adhering to such theories. For example, many people believe that the end times are near. As we shall see later, this belief is as ill-defined as the omen. As Albert Einstein said, as simple as possible, but not simpler. For our next common mistake, consider the story of Asterix and the seer. It goes as follows. During a thunderstorm, a man finds shelter in the village of Asterix. The man says that he knew that the thunderstorm would be coming, and he knew that he would find shelter in that village. When the perplexed villagers ask him how he knew all of this, he replies, "I'm a seer." However, the seer just claims he foresaw whatever happened. He waits until something happens, and then says he knew that it would happen. Therefore, the seer is not actually making predictions. He is making postdictions. The real challenge is, of course, to build theories that predict not just the known, but also the unknown. The essential quality of a true theory is that it is true not just for the case at hand, but also for the cases in the future. There's an analogy to religion here. As we shall see later, some people believe that their religious book saw something coming. However, never has a religious person made a new invention by carefully studying Scripture, sold their home because a holy book correctly predicted the date of a war, or invested in the right company because of a prediction found in the Bible. The predictions are made only ever after the fact. As we will argue, this puts such predictions on the same level as the predictions of the seer. As some wise person said, science is the journey to the truth. Religion is pretending you're already there. To illustrate our next common mistake in reasoning, let us look at the war between the United States and Iraq in the early 2000s. When the United States captured the Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein in 2003, the oil price initially fell. Hence, newspapers ran stories explaining that the capture gave confidence that the war would be over, which would lower the price of oil in the long run. Shortly thereafter, however, oil prices rose. Hence, newspapers ran stories explaining that the capture has created new conditions for the mission in Iraq, and that this insecurity has driven up oil prices. In reality, there was possibly no causal relation whatsoever, as oil prices tend to fluctuate in any case. However, humans tend to add causality to unrelated events. This tendency is what Lebanese-American statistician Nassim Taleb calls the narrative fallacy. This tendency to storify may have a very simple reason, Taleb hypothesizes. It is easier to remember events if they are connected in some way. As an example, consider the sentence, "The king died and then the queen died." Now compare it to, "The king died and then the queen died of grief." It is somehow easier to remember the second story because it seems to contain just a single piece of information with its consequence, rather than two unrelated events. Rephrasing the initial story as a causal sequence may thus be a technique of dimensionality reduction, that is, of data compression. This may explain why people have a tendency to consider the second sequence more probable than the first, even though the second actually implies the first. The same phenomenon appears in religion. People have a tendency to add supernatural causality to the events of life. For example, they might say, this and that happened because God wanted it this way, because He has a grander plan with us. Not because there would be any evidence for such a causality, but because it makes the events of life more palatable. We will discuss this way of thinking in the chapter on the God of the gaps and in the chapter on the Abrahamic God. As Daniel Kahneman said, no one ever made a decision because of a number. They need a story. For our next point, let us consider one of the biggest unsolved conundrums in the history of aviation: the fate of Air Malaysia flight MH370. This airplane disappeared shortly after takeoff in 2014 and has never been found. Despite the most expensive search in aviation history, nobody knows what happened to MH370. However, imagine that your friend, let's call her Patricia, has long been suspecting aliens behind the disappearance. She comes up with the following rule. If aliens shoot down an airplane over the ocean, then that airplane drowns in the sea. That rule is certainly true. Patricia now uses this rule to argue that aliens shot down MH370. If the airplane disappeared, then it must have been aliens who shot it. This reasoning is obviously faulty. There could be numerous reasons that made MH370 disappear, and aliens shooting at it is just one of the possibilities, and one of the less likely ones at that. Patricia's reasoning is called abductive reasoning. It starts from the conclusion of the rule, the airplane disappeared, to wrongly deduce the premise that aliens shot it down. Patricia will defend her conclusion as follows. You don't believe my claim? Well, look at it. The airplane disappeared. Isn't that enough evidence? Nobody can explain how MH370 disappeared. Only I can explain it, and aliens are the simplest explanation for the disappearance. Therefore, my reasoning must be right. Is that correct? It is true that nobody can explain how MH370 disappeared. However, that does not make Patricia's hypothesis true. If we argue that an explanation must be true because we can imagine no other, we commit a fallacy known as the argument from ignorance. Something does not become true just because we cannot imagine it any other way. In order to accept a hypothesis as true, we need a rule that has the hypothesis not in the premise, but in conclusion. That is, we need a rule of the form, if X then aliens shot down the plane. In other words, we need evidence for the hypothesis. Until such evidence appears, the correct answer to what happened to MH370 is we do not know. It is easy to see that our example bears similarities to the question, who created the world? From the fact that we do not know the answer, believers of different religions deduce that it was their particular gods who created the world. This, however, does not make their hypotheses true. Our example analogy can be continued. Your other friend Paul has long suspected the Russians behind the disappearance of MH370. Hence, he comes up with the rule, if Russia shoots down an airplane over the ocean, then this plane disappears. Paul uses this rule, wrongly, to deduce that Russia shot down the plane. Now, something very interesting happens. When Paul and Patricia meet, they will start arguing about who shot down the plane. Since both of them believe in abductive reasoning, neither can invalidate the claim of the other. The line of reasoning used by one of them can be used to support the hypothesis of the other. Each of them has an equally convincing argument, but the claims are contradictory. Of course, neither argument is correct, because in order to assert a hypothesis, we need evidence for it, that is, a rule that implies it. However, if people do not subscribe to the necessity of evidence for hypotheses, they can go on arguing forever. This is indeed what we observe in discussions about religious truth. Our next fallacy is called counting the hits. Imagine a woman called Chelsea who drives to work this morning. Her dad warns her that he has the bad feeling that Chelsea might have an accident. Indeed, that day Chelsea has an accident. Predictably, his dad says that he told her so. Chelsea reminds him that he has been warning her about accidents every morning for the past 2 years. Thus, the theory that her dad can predict accidents was correct in only 1 out of around 660 cases. That ratio is too bad to call his theory true. The theory is in fact false. Technically speaking, the theory has failed the test of validation. It has delivered numerous false predictions in the past and has hence to be rejected. Even a false theory can make a true prediction from time to time, but that still does not make the theory true. Looking only at the cases where the theory makes a true prediction is a fallacy called counting the hits. Again, this fallacy can also be encountered in religion. When it comes to the efficiency of prayer, for example, many people are willing to count the hits only, and to disregard the cases where prayer did not work. As Amy Edmondson said, neither people nor organizations can learn if they deny that an error has happened. Our next fallacy revolves around useless premises. Imagine that your superstitious friend Sarah has the theory that on Friday the 13th, there will be car accidents. This theory has made correct predictions in the past, and it continues to do so. Is Sarah finally right with her superstitions? Yes and no. The theory that there are car accidents on Friday 13th is true, but it is unsatisfactory for a different reason. The prediction there are car accidents is true, no matter whether it is Friday 13th or not. The premise of the theory does not add any insight. For such theories, we can develop arbitrary variations. For example, we can construct the theory that on Tuesday the 17th, there will be car accidents. This theory is as true as the Friday the 13th theory. It is clear that with this argument, we can take any number as an unlucky number, or as a lucky number for that matter. And indeed, in some countries, residents view 17 as an unlucky number, and in others, 13 is viewed as unlucky. Technically speaking, Sarah's theory contains a useless premise. The condition of Friday the 13th can just be removed. The resulting theory is, on any given day there will be car accidents. This theory predicts all days on which car accidents will occur, which are all days of the year. It compresses more events than the theory of Friday the 13th, and therefore is more general than the theory of Friday the 13th. Again, we can see a link with religious beliefs. Some people believe that prayer cures illnesses. They uphold this claim even for illnesses that disappear by themselves. In such cases, prayer is a useless premise in the sense of this book. As William Golding said, the greatest ideas are the simplest. Our next fallacy is called wishful thinking. Imagine that you have a friend, let's call him Bill, who is a very happy person. One day you talk to him and you ask him why he is always so happy. He pulls you aside and whispers, "It's because I'm rich." You are surprised, because Bill doesn't look particularly rich, and from what you can tell, he seems to possess only a single pair of trousers. You ask, "What do you mean you are rich?" Bill whispers, "I believe that I have a treasure hidden in my garden." You say that this is great, and you ask him whether he checked. He says no, he didn't check. You ask then why he believes he has a treasure in the garden if he didn't even check. Bill replies, "Well, would you want to be poor?" You are perplexed. From the fact that Bill does not want to be poor, it does not follow that there's a treasure in his garden. Such a rule is just plain wrong, meaning that it produces conclusions that do not correspond to reality. Such thinking is called wishful thinking. Absurd as such thinking may seem, it plays a role in the popularity of religions as well. People believe in something, like the afterlife, the power of prayer, or a supposed ultimate justice, merely because they want it to be true. Let us continue for a moment on the fallacy of wishful thinking. In our example, your friend Bill believes that he has a treasure hidden in his garden. As this is obviously very unlikely to be true, you are worried, and you talk with a common friend of yours. She tells you, "And so what? If this makes Bill happy, just let him believe he has a treasure in the garden." You ask, "So if that makes him happy, is it true that he has a treasure in the garden?" And your friend is wise enough to say, "If a belief makes you happy, it doesn't mean it's true." While you are still pondering this wisdom, your friend suggests, "You look as if you could use some happiness in your life too. Why do you not also start believing that there is a treasure in your garden?" You are perplexed. It does not make sense to believe something that you know to be false just to be happy. Believing in a false theory will lead to false conclusions. Such belief is thus ultimately treacherous. And yet, as we shall discuss, this argument is frequently brought forward in favor of faith as well. Belief makes people happy, so why don't you start believing as well? Our next fallacy revolves around meaningless statements. Let us suppose you are inviting your friend Sandra over for dinner. Sandra is very happy to join you. However, as soon as she steps into your place, she starts looking around and seems to be worried. You ask whether everything is all right. Sandra replies, "Yes, everything is all right," but says, "There is something here." You ask, "What do you mean there is something here?" Sandra says, "I don't know, I just feel there's something here." She continues to walk around, looks behind the door, checks the kitchen sink, and verifies that there's nothing under the table. You are worried and ask her, "Sandra, what is it? Are you okay? Do you need anything? Did you see anything? Is there a smell?" But she just says that yes, she's okay, she doesn't need anything, she didn't smell anything, and she didn't see anything. It's just that as she keeps saying, "There is something here." Later, to your relief, she seems to have forgotten about it, and the evening turns out to be really nice. After she left, you still wonder what she meant by, "There is something here." It did not mean that she was uncomfortable, that she would need something, or that she would smell or see something particular. In fact, the statement didn't seem to mean anything. You try to fit Sandra's statement into the theory of truth that you read in this book, and you find that from the fact that there is something here, you cannot deduce anything about your place. Nothing to see, nothing to smell, nothing to worry about. There is no rule that has this statement in its premise. Thus, the statement is literally meaningless in the sense of this book. It does not have any meaning outside Sandra's head. We will later argue that many statements in the spiritual domain fall in the same category. Examples are, there exists a universal principle of the universe. There is a conscious being behind everything. And even God is the first cause of the universe. We will later argue that these claims are on the same level as Sandra's, "There is something here." They allow for no concrete predictions about the real world either, and are thus ultimately meaningless. Our next fallacy involves what we will call empty statements. Let us assume that Andy is your friend from high school, and you still meet him from time to time. One day, Andy pours out his heart to you and tells you how he suffers in his relationship. You listen attentively and comfort your friend. Andy is very grateful and tells you that you are really the best friend he has. You are happy that you could help and that he appreciated it. A few days later, you go with Andy to a bar. Andy is still sad and orders a scotch. The waitress sees that Andy's having a difficult time and pities him. She brings peanuts on the house and tells him to cheer up. Andy smiles at her and tells her that she's really the best friend he has. She smiles back. Later that evening, a client who has drunk too much gets rude and acts aggressively towards the waitress. Andy seems visibly uncomfortable and proposes that the two of you should leave the bar quickly. At this point in time, you understand two things. First, Andy actually calls everybody best friend. Second, this phrase does not mean anything to him, as he does not even consider helping the waitress. Technically speaking, you cannot deduce anything from the fact that Andy calls you his best friend. Neither that you are the only best friend, nor that Andy will do anything more for you than he does for a random person in the street. There is no rule of the form, if you are Andy's best friend, then X. Thus, the statement, you are Andy's best friend, is technically meaningless. This is different from the usual semantics of the phrase best friend. If a normal person calls you best friend, then you can deduce a number of things from this. First of all, you are the only best friend. Second, that person will give you special treatment and help you when you are in trouble. Andy, in contrast, uses the phrase in another way. The way Andy uses the word gives it no meaning at all. It becomes an empty word. We will later argue that some religious statements such as, every person is a sinner, God loves you, or we are the chosen people, are of the very same nature as being Andy's best friend. They carry a strong suggestive meaning, but boil down to senselessness when questioned. Our next fallacy revolves around unfalsifiable statements. Let us suppose that your friend Chris is convinced that one of his colleagues fell in love with him. However, the woman appears to treat him just like any other colleague. When you challenge Chris on his conviction, Chris argues, I agree that she treats me just like any other colleague. She loves me, but she is too shy to show it. Chris argues that the woman would never admit her love and would never act on it out of fear to lose her job. Chris asks, prove me wrong. Since, indeed, the woman behaves exactly as Chris predicts, that is hard to do. And so Chris cherishes his secret love. Does that mean that Chris's hypothesis is true? Does the woman really love him, but is just too shy to act on it? After all, this claim cannot be proven false. As the attentive reader will have noticed, this immediately makes the hypothesis unfalsifiable. That is, we cannot find a condition X such that if X, then Chris's hypothesis is false. This means by modus tollens that we cannot find a rule of the form, if Chris's hypothesis is true, then X is false. Indeed, we cannot find any rule of the form, if Chris's hypothesis is true, then something. This means that when Chris's hypothesis is true, he will not be able to conclude anything from it. He knows that the woman is in love with him, but agrees that this does not show in her behavior, and never will. In the terminology of this book, the phrase, the woman is in love with him but acts in any aspect like she were not, has no meaning. There is no perception statement that follows from this hypothesis. The phrase is literally meaningless. A meaningless phrase does not help at all in understanding this world, in explaining the past, or in predicting the future. It is just not worth debating. It is interesting to note that our example bears noticeable similarities to phrases such as, God loves us, but does not show it in an obvious way, or even to statements such as, God exists, but you cannot see him. Heaven will punish you in the afterlife, but you cannot prove it, or you will be reborn, but you cannot know it. All of these statements are unfalsifiable and hence meaningless. They are on the same level as, the woman loves me, but does not show it. And yet they are the bedrock of religions, as we shall see in the chapter on memes. Let us now move on and see how our theory of truth can help distinguish myths from facts. As an example, let us consider the ancient Greek story of Persephone. Persephone is the goddess of spring, and she goes to the god of the underworld, Hades, each year. This leaves her mother, Demeter, the goddess of earth, sad, and so she makes it cold. This explains why winter is cold. Is that a good explanation for the temperature drop in winter? To answer this question, let us look at the story of Persephone in detail. It goes roughly as follows. Hades forces Persephone to come back to him every winter. If someone is forced to go somewhere, then that person goes there. If Persephone is in Hades, her mother Demeter is sad. If Demeter is sad, then it is cold. As long as the only meaning of Hades forces Persephone to come back to him is that it is cold in winter, the story is true. In that case, Persephone would just be another name for summer heat, and the story just says that in winter there is no summer heat. That is correct. However, we usually associate more meaning with Hades and Persephone. We assume that they are gods, that they have feelings, that Hades loves Persephone, etc. Now, what is the evidence for the hypothesis that Hades is a god? Or for the hypothesis that he loves Persephone? Busted. There is no evidence for these statements. Hence, we have no reason to consider them true. Therefore, the story is just a ghostification of the fact that winter and summer alternate. As we see, the terminology of this book can help us tell facts from fiction. Our next topic is the supernatural. Based on our theory of truth, we can now formally define the supernatural. It is tempting to define the supernatural as anything for which there is no evidence. For example, we could argue that God is supernatural because there is no evidence for his existence. The issue with this definition is that many believers insist that there is actually evidence for their supernatural entities. That is, that there is a true theory that predicts the existence of these entities, and that this theory has not yet been found, has not yet been sufficiently validated, or has just not yet been applied correctly. In fact, many proofs for the supernatural argue with such theories. Thus, simply agreeing that God is supernatural would require solving one of the biggest conundrums of humanity, proving that there is no evidence for God's existence. Quite fortunately, the converse, assuming that God's existence cannot be disproven, is both sufficient to define the supernatural and easier to establish. Believers will typically agree easily that God's existence cannot be disproven. Whatever happens, it does not question the existence of God. And for an atheist, assuming that God's existence cannot be disproven amounts to unfalsifiability and thus to meaninglessness, which is indeed one of the ways to define atheism. In this spirit, we define a supernatural statement as a statement that, on principle, cannot be falsified, or, by extension, such a theory. Note that, with this definition, being supernatural is a property of statements and theories and not of entities. In other words, it is not God himself who is unfalsifiable, but the statement, God exists. Other supernatural statements and theories are, there is life after death, or, if you have done only good things in life, then you will go to heaven. And these are, likewise, unfalsifiable. Not every unfalsifiable theory is supernatural, because not every theory that is unfalsifiable is so on principle. For example, the theory, if you pull the lever of the slot machine in the right way, then you will win, is unfalsifiable, but not so on principle. Once we endeavor to properly define pulling the lever in the right way, that is, to ground the theory in reality, for example, by describing the parameters of speed and direction, the theory becomes falsifiable. A theory is supernatural only if such grounding cannot be achieved on principle, and the theory is thus shielded from human perception. We may regret that this definition of the supernatural is not something objective, but depends on whether the interlocutors agree on the principled unfalsifiability of some statement, that is, on the impossibility of grounding it in perceptions. While this objection is justified, our definition is in line with the entire theory of truth that we develop in this chapter. It holds that the models of reality that humans build are inherently dependent on their own perceptions, and hence usually imperfect. We will later argue that this does not hamper mutual agreement on truth. As Pascal Boyer said, religion is a complex issue. This is why it takes several chapters to approach a question that many people, in my experience, can solve to their entire satisfaction in a few seconds of dinner table conversation. Our next topic is truth and atheism. Atheism is the rejection of belief in the supernatural. Before, we only had a very vague description of the supernatural. With our new definition of the supernatural, we can now explain what atheism means. When we say that atheists reject belief in the supernatural, we mean that supernatural statements are not part of the statements that atheists believe. Positive atheism goes further and holds that the supernatural does not exist. Technically, positive atheism is a theory of the form, if t is a time point, then the supernatural does not exist at time point t. The meaning of the supernatural does not exist at time point t is that prayer has no effect at time point t, that no God will reveal himself in a verifiable way that no proof for reincarnation or life spirits is found, etc., we will later argue that this theory is not just falsifiable, but also validated. It has made exclusively true predictions so far. Therefore, positive atheists assume it to be true. As Roy Soblowski said, "What evidence would prove that some occurrence was supernatural? None, because if it was observed, it was natural. And if it was not observed, we have no reason to believe that it occurred." Our next topic is truth subjective? The theory of truth put forward in this chapter says that we judge the truth of a theory by comparing its conclusions to our experiences. If the conclusions correspond to our experiences, we call the theory true. Since nothing guarantees that other people have the same perceptions as everyone else, this means that someone else can have a completely different truth. Indeed, it is a long-standing philosophical conundrum, whether truth is absolute or subjective. With the concepts that we have seen in this chapter, however, we can find a way out. We can build the theory that if a healthy person has some impression, be it a noise, a smell, or a visual perception, then other healthy people in the same spot at the same time will have that same impression. This theory makes generally true predictions, to a degree that people who do not have the same impressions as everyone else are considered to have a health problem, almost by definition. Now comes the interesting part. If people perceive the same way as everyone else, then they will evaluate the truth of a given theory in a given case in the same way as everyone else as well. For example, if some theory predicts a rainbow, and if someone observes that the theory makes a correct prediction on a given day, then other people in their vicinity will also make this observation. Thus, if we wanted to determine whether a given theory is true, we would just have to validate or reject the theory together by making the same observations together. This in turn entails that truth itself, as defined in this book, is objective. As Thomas Nagel said, the claim, "everything is subjective," must be nonsense, for it would itself have to be either subjective or objective. But it can't be objective, since in that case it would be false if true. And it can't be subjective, because then it would not rule out any objective claim, including the claim that it is objectively false. Our next topic is the objection that science is not everything. The approach to truth that this chapter puts forward may look rather scientific. It is based on theories, evidence, and testability. Indeed, this chapter's notion of truth is just an extension of the scientific principle itself. And yet, as the reader might object, science is not everything. This book does not claim that everybody should have to follow the proposed way of thinking, let alone that it is the only one. It does claim, however, that most people consider trustworthy those theories which have made true predictions in the past, and that most people mistrust theories that have made no predictions or false predictions in the past. To see this, consider an example. In a casino, someone tells you that he can predict the outcome of the roulette. You trust him and bet the money as he says. It does not work. You try again. Again, it does not work. You have already lost a substantial amount of money. Would you trust his predictions again? Probably not. This guy was just wrong. But by not trusting him, you act scientific. You decided to reject a theory based on false predictions. The bottom line is that for the most part, we all operate according to this principle whenever it comes to trusting people or theories. It is true that we are vulnerable to bias and error. However, clearly not all of us are vulnerable all the time. Otherwise, we would not even be able to say that we are vulnerable to bias and error. As Steven Pinker said, the human brain is capable of reasoning, given the right circumstances. The goal is to identify those circumstances and to put them more firmly in place. Our next topic is the objection that one cannot prove everything. This chapter proposes that evidence for a hypothesis is a true theory that predicts this hypothesis. Now, unfortunately, we do not have evidence for all hypotheses that we make. In fact, for the vast majority of hypotheses, we do not have any evidence at all. Even if we have evidence, there may be counter-evidence. This means that, strictly speaking, we would have to go through a process of joint reasoning before deciding the truth of that statement. And yet in everyday life, we rarely do that. Therefore, is the theory of truth put forward in this chapter not just absurd? On a humanist view, everyone is free to believe what they want. There is no moral necessity to prove anything. However, we rarely believe just anything. Rather, we usually judge the likelihood of a hypothesis by our experience, as in the previous example of the roulette player. Technically speaking, this experience is nothing else than the set of theories that we have accumulated in our lifetime. It's just that we rarely make these theories explicit. But when we are asked why we believe in something, then we will certainly have our reasons. Again, technically speaking, these reasons are explanations in the sense of this book. Thus, by and large, we do use the methods of this book, just in a watered-down variant that is much less formal than presented here. That is all fine, of course. But things are different when it comes to more serious questions. For example, when it comes to constructing a skyscraper, it would be foolish to rely just on the intuition of the architects. You would want engineers to thoroughly verify that the building is stable and safe. In that case, you would insist on formal methods. The same is true when it comes to anything that influences your life. Say, for example, that your doctor prescribes you a new medicine. If she tells you that this medicine has never been tested, you would certainly hesitate to take it. It would be of poor comfort to you if the doctor assures you that if you really deserve the healing, this medicine will not be lethal. Even if you are not familiar with the principle of falsifiability, you would realize that there is something wrong with this doctor. You would insist on taking only medicine that has been tested thoroughly beforehand. And so this is the compromise that we use. In our everyday lives, we use some informal methods to decide what we believe in. These informal methods are vaguely related to the theory of truth of this chapter. For anything that engages our lives crucially, we insist on formal methods that align with the approach spelled out in this chapter. The distinction between these two modes of reasoning resembles what Israeli-American psychologist and economist Daniel Kahneman has called System 1 and System 2. This book will argue in the chapter on criticism of religion that anything that restricts people's lives drastically, anything that impacts the lives of others, and anything that claims absolute truth, read religion, falls in the second class of cases. It requires examination via the formal type of methods. At the very least, it should be falsifiable. That is the minimal condition for even just being considered in earnest. Our next topic is, what is the meaning of love? The meaning of a statement is the set of rules in which it appears. To find the meaning of love, consider the following as a starting point. If you love someone, you want to always be with that person. If you love someone, you feel happy when that person is around. And if you love someone, you want to help that person wherever you can. Compare this meaning of love with what believers call God's love. Does this concept have the same meaning as interhuman love? That is, can you draw the same conclusions from the fact that God loves you? We discussed this question in the chapter on the Abrahamic God. As Olaf said, love is putting someone else's needs before yours. Our next topic is, what is the meaning of mathematical concepts? Mathematical concepts are labels for real-world phenomena. For example, when I say there are 5 apples, I mean there is 1 apple for each finger of my right hand. Thus, 5 is simply an abbreviation for the fact that a group has as many elements as we have fingers. When we say 5 plus 5 is 10, then this is an abbreviation for when you have as many apples as you have fingers on your right hand, and you have as many bananas as you have fingers on your right hand, then you have as many fruits as you have fingers on both hands. It is way more convenient to say 5 plus 5 is 10. Based on this, we can come up with plenty of rules in which these labels appear. For example, if x plus y is z, then y plus x is also z. Based on these rules, we can define square roots, complex numbers, logarithms, and everything else. These theories make predictions. In the simplest case, they make predictions about the real world, as in, if you have 2 apples and you add 1 more, you will have 3 apples. In the cases of more abstract mathematics, the theories still make predictions. For example, if the binary logarithm of a certain number is x, then 2 to the power of x will yield that number. This prediction rarely finds its uses in everyday life, but it is undoubtedly a prediction, and a true one at that. As Daniel Montano said, you can't believe in math. You have to understand it. You can't understand religion. You have to believe it. Our next topic is, what about historical facts? Historians reconstruct past events from human artifacts, written accounts of events, archaeological sites, and other sources. Technically speaking, they have a number of theories, such as, if a person appears on a coin, then that person was a ruler of a state, or if a contemporary historian wrote a book, then things happen as written in that book. These theories are not always correct. They may make false predictions. For example, a person on a coin could be a deity instead of a ruler. However, in a large part of the cases, the theories are known to be correct, because otherwise they would be abandoned. Thus, historians basically have a set of imperfect rules. From these, they try to deduce what most likely happened in the past. If several rules predict the same thing, and no rule predicts the contrary, then the historian accepts this thing as the most likely course of history. This thing, however, may turn out to be false. For example, it was widely assumed that Cleopatra, the queen of ancient Egypt, committed suicide by a snake bite. Nowadays, some historians are questioning this version of history, based on the fact that a snake bite would have caused severe bleeding that is not mentioned in sources. As the reader may have noticed, we have just presented evidence that could suggest that the common assumption about Cleopatra's death is incorrect. Thus, we have shown that a historical conviction can be falsified. Therefore, historical facts are not meaningless. They have their role in the physical course of time. As Enrico Fermi said, there are two possible outcomes. If the result confirms the hypothesis, then you've made a measurement. If the result is contrary to the hypothesis, then you've made a discovery. Our next topic is, this theory of truth limits one's view of the world. This chapter defines truth by building on perception statements. It cuts away anything that does not ultimately talk about perceptions. This raises the question whether this view of truth is not too limited. All metaphysical concepts, for example, are cut off. It turns out that there are theories that are grounded in perceptions and theories that are not. The first class of theories can make tangible predictions, whereas the second one cannot. This holds no matter how you define the concept of truth. The first class of theories is the subject of science. This holds by definition because science is what is concerned with the natural world. Science encompasses not just physics. It encompasses also psychology, biology, history, and sociology. The second class of theories is not about perceptions. This does not mean that this class of theories would be useless. Such theories can make up stories, metaphors, or poems. These can provide entertainment, consolation, or inspiration. However, they cannot provide true predictions. Our next topic is truth is a false concept. It has been argued that we cannot be sure whether the physical system in which we perceive ourselves really exists. Most famously, maybe in the movie The Matrix, there could be no physical system at all. There could be also multiple such systems. Then our sensations would be just impressions that have nothing to do with any physical world. Reality would not exist, and truth itself would be a false concept. This is certainly a fascinating theory, as the popularity of the movie shows. However, what would be concrete predictions that this theory allows for? It turns out that no single perception can be predicted. When we assume that reality does not exist, or that truth is a false concept, we are no wiser than before. Thus, the theory that reality does not exist is literally meaningless. It is completely irrelevant for our life. We could as well claim that you are dead and what you think is your life are in fact just hallucinations of some surviving neurons in your brain. Such theories lead nowhere. They do not talk about our perceptions and thus do not even qualify to be considered for being true. As Wolfgang Pauli said, this theory is not only not true, it is not even false.